Hello everybody, my name is Nikki Graham and I will be doing the presentation, one of the presentations that is part of Section 2, Health Equity and Populations of Concern. The title of this presentation is called Effective Partnerships with Indigenous Communities. I am a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana. It's just north of Missoula, Montana, and we are part of the Flathead Reservation. As part of this presentation, we definitely want to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I've switched it up just a tad in that I am a member of this tribe. So I acknowledge that I reside on the homelands of the Salish, Kalispel, and Kootenai people. Today I offer respect for the history and the culture and for the wisdom in caring for this place for the generations to come. So the Flathead Indian Reservation is where I come from. All right, so introduction of myself. I am many things, I would say. I have many titles. I am a daughter, I am a wife, I'm a niece, I'm a cousin, I'm so many things. The one that's most recent to us is being a grandmother. So we have two grandchildren. We have a granddaughter and a grandson, so I'm otherwise known as Nana. Within the university system, so I actually get the honor of working with both university systems in Montana. So at Montana State University, I'm working with the American Indian Alaska Native clinical translational research projects, and then part of my work at the University of Montana is actually working with the School of Public and Community Health Sciences as a graduate student support coordinator. Also on here you'll see that my little diagram of the horse. We ride horses. We have many horses. On the right-hand side, you'll see huckleberries. This is definitely the season for huckleberries, and we've had the great opportunity to gather many, many gallons of huckleberries this year. So while this presentation is one piece of who I am and my experience, certainly there is so much more to us as a people and to this presentation. So where do I come from? I represent the Flathead Nation, so it's over here in Montana, the west side of the state. We have a very large reservation, which most reservations actually in Montana are quite large. We have a beautiful lake, otherwise known as Flathead Lake, and another little bit piece about me, I was raised on a ranch with Hereford cattle. We raised a little over 100 head, so I was very much part of that growing experience, and sometimes these little guys were in our homes so that we could warm them up in the middle of the winter and care for them as they were trying to survive some of the awful winters that we had. So the objectives for today's presentation, we have three objectives. The first one is barriers and limitations in relationship building for health-related programs and research within diverse communities. The second objective for today is going to be identifying CBR principles that strengthen relationships with Indigenous populations. And then lastly, create a strategy to build partnerships for better health that incorporates cultural values and community requests. Okay, so now we're going to talk about barriers and limitations. And when I was putting together this PowerPoint presentation, I was definitely trying to make sure that I took a couple different views with this. So the two views that I thought were most important was the researcher view, and so the person from the outside, as well as the community or their partner view. And so to start this off, there's several bullet points here, and I think I could have added many, many bullet points, but I thought these were probably the most important. But I will say that most of them are intertwined. Like they're there, but they're also connected to the other, very much like a spider web, in that there's so many connections that they tie into one another. So as we go through this, I'll share some of my experiences that I've had over the past 4 years working with different researchers from various organizations and university systems, but certainly I can't share all of my stories. So let's start off with a personal commitment. And this is really about your ability to do this project and to do the work. Is your plate full, or is it something that has space? I have met researchers who their plate is so full. This is just one more thing to add, and I feel like there's been times where I was wondering if it was a check mark, and that's certainly not something we would recommend, right? We definitely want to make sure that you have the time to participate in the research, to be a part of the research, and be part of the community as you're trying to complete your project. So ask yourself what kind of personal commitment you can make to this. Secondly, timeline. Many times I've seen researchers put together timelines, and while they look great on paper, they don't do well within the community context, in that summers can be super heavy for some researchers who are, that they wait for the summertime to be their strong point where they're working on their research projects pretty heavily. And unfortunately, in many of our communities, that's a time of celebration. That is time where we get out of town, or maybe we go on our vacations and do our things. So trying to bring community members together during summer times can be difficult. That's just one example. Sometimes I've seen situations where we've set up a meeting and it's taken 2 months to find the perfect time for everybody to meet, and then one day before the meeting we have a loss in the community and there's a wake, and there will not be a meeting because folks will be participating in the wake and in those celebrations and services. So it can work even in the best of plannings, and sometimes in the worst of plannings it can still work in some ways. So timeline is super important. I think there's timelines I've seen that are just not long enough, in that is 12 months long enough? Is 24 months long enough? Is this a project that's going to last for 36 months? So what does your timeline look like? Next, we have time allocations, and certainly this is kind of reverts back to the personal commitment of time, but I think it's really important that you ask yourself, do I have 0.2 time for this project? Do I have 0.5? What's the reality, and what can I give to this? Keeping in mind that sometimes when you're drawing up the proposal or the ideas in your timeline, you think, oh, I've got plenty of time to do this, once this week and once that week, and then all of a sudden something happens where meetings have been shut down or the COVID curveball kicks in, and it takes months and months before we're able to really reconnect or get people set up on Zoom or other forms of communication to make a meeting happen. So time allocations are super important to visit and see what is a reality for you and how flexible you might be. Next, we have budget. I think budget is certainly a little bit of a tricky situation. Budget can relate to travel time. Do you have a budget to come to the community and be part of the community, even if there's no outcomes? Is there a budget allocated towards community members? Is it for participants? Is it for advisory boards? We'll talk more about that in a little bit too. Where's the money going? So really reconsider or take the time to think about where are the dollars being spent. The next I have on here is benefit. So think about who is going to benefit from this work. Many times, certainly, on the university level, there's certain benefits to having publications and so forth. But is the benefit solely at the university or academic level, or is the benefit within the community? And our goal, or at least my goal, would be to make sure that benefit is unilateral, like there's benefit on both sides of the equation, if that's possible. What are your goals? So when I put this down, I was like, wow, what are my goals? There's times when I've made my goals and they just seem so lofty, and I'm like, someday I'll get here. And that's totally fine. But what are your goals? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? Maybe this is the first project, maybe this is the 13th project. But understanding what you want to accomplish and what your goals are super important. And hopefully down the road you've been able to share those with the community so they understand where you hope to go. one day. And maybe those goals will align with community, maybe they won't. And how can you work with those? The next thing I have on here is behind the wheel, or otherwise people, another word for it would be wheel time. In that, or seat time, I guess is the right answer, or is the right words. So how committed are you to being behind the wheel and going to the community? Here on the Flathead, I've heard numerous comments about, well, we're so close to the University of Montana, so of course we're going to get their research projects. Of course they're going to be looking at us because we're the closest reservation. And sometimes I feel like that's totally true. And then there's researchers I work with that are working with Blackfeet, or they're working with Fort Peck. And so certainly those are some time commitments when you're thinking about driving clear across the state, right? But are you willing to do that? And then also considering, you kind of roll back to the budget, do you have enough funds to do that? What happens in the winter? Or what happens if you get snowed in Browning, Montana, and you can't dig out for 4 or 5 days? Making sure that you have some wiggle room within your budget for those kind of situations. But for the most part, it takes time to be here. And so in Montana, at least, you're behind the wheel and you're driving. You might be able to fly, but for the most part, you're going to be on the roads and traveling. So do you have that time? The next thing I have on here is transparency. This has come up multiple times, and I would say, to some regard, in most of the projects that I've worked on, in that what has been written. So if a grant has been written and it was prior to any relationship with the tribal community, that can be tough because those are the grant writer's words, not necessarily the community words. And so sometimes when we've read through those proposals, there's situations where we kind of look at each other and go, I wonder why they said this. That's not here. That might be another reservation, but that doesn't work for us as a people. So transparency goes, far back as it can possibly go, in that whether it's the development of a grant proposal or a funding proposal of any sort, what the budget looks like and how those monies are being allocated. One of the stories I typically share with my researchers is that when we look at the budget, I've had elders say, yeah, they probably live in a really nice home and can pay their mortgage, but I got $10 for my time. And I've lived here all my life, and what I shared with that person is definitely worth more than $10. So definitely take some time and think about what that might look like for you and how transparent can you be. I think community members are pretty cued into research at this point, at least here in the folks that I've worked with, and they will ask, what does your budget look like? Do you, are you spending it this way or that way? Or they want to know, because this is about them. And they want to make sure that people are being compensated adequately, and they can even help you make those decisions as to what is adequate. The next point I have on here is understanding of community. This is tough. This is probably one of those I was like, oh, how do I really bring this up? And the reality is that this is difficult. Depending upon your subject and your topic matter, it's something that it can be very different from one thing to another. And the example I'd like to use is maybe a project with diabetes. And you're reaching out to the community and you want to talk about diabetes and build something, a program, or find ways for American Indians to be healthier within diabetes diagnosis. And so what I've noticed is that sometimes when that is brought to a community or to certain community members, one family may have just lost somebody and it was solely due to diabetes. So when they hear those words, it brings back this past of trauma, of like loss and sadness. And then on another point, it could be a family who was just recently diagnosed, and somebody in the family has it now, and so there's a lot of change in meal planning, or maybe there's not any change in meal planning, like they can survive or they can do whatever they need to do. So community members can have a very different taste in their mouth, and experience with any sort of topic. And so learning about how that community feels about that topic or what their past experiences have been in that topic is super important. And that's something that you have to build that right in the beginning, understanding what those feelings and those emotions might be. Maybe there are no feelings or emotions, but maybe there's confusion as to the terminology that's being used and so forth. So understanding the community can be a little bit of a trick. So we'll talk more about other ways and strategies to make that happen. What are your past and recent experiences? Have you worked within this community before? Was it a positive experience? Was it a struggle? Or have you really assessed what that experience was like for you? Or have you worked in other communities? And I would say that certainly there's some researchers who are seasoned in, they've worked with multiple tribal communities. But what happens in one tribal community doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work in another community. We're very different. And sometimes it's night and day difference, and sometimes it's just a slight difference depending upon who you're talking to or what kind of concepts you're trying to process. But ask yourself, what are your experiences? And if you don't have experiences, try to see if you can reach out to other researchers who have had experiences and listen to what they have experienced and try to learn from some of the things that they have taken or have learned in their own experiences. Approval process is the next bullet. This one is tricky. Holy smolies. I would say that approval processes are not always written. So you need to ask. They're not always posted on a website, and there's a specific checklist for you to go through to make sure it's going to happen. Some tribal processes include tribal council. Some of them involve elder committees or culture committees. Some of them involve boards of health. Some of them involve tribal IRBs, so internal review processes. And so it's just a full spectrum. So I'm trying to ask, I encourage you to ask, what are some of those approval processes? Because certainly as a researcher, you know that your university has their processes, right? But those processes and those approvals could be very different in Indigenous communities. So reaching out and trying to learn what those processes might be. And I would also encourage you that even if you are talking to colleagues and they say, well, I did X, Y, and Z, it doesn't mean that that is still the process. So be sure to ask your community members and try to find some folks within the community that can help you with that, because things change. And so that can be a little bit of a curveball. Availability of the community. So this is definitely something that I've noticed in that there's been times where researchers have reached out and said, well, I want to do this research with this community, and the community is just like, yeah, nope, we're not ready for that. We're not going to talk about that. Or I think the one experience I saw with this was with a suicide research and suicidal ideations and understanding that. And a community was approached, and they were like, no, we're not going to talk about this. And multiple people from that community shared that this was just something that was just too real and too fresh for them. And many times it was just something that just recently happened. So it wasn't something that they felt that should be in a researcher's hands, as they were still processing the loss and the grief and so forth. So sometimes the topics are just too fresh for a community to really understand where you're going with it, or what you'd like to learn from that. And so sometimes that can be a really difficult situation. So they could just say, no, we're not interested. So be ready for that. Location. I think I kind of mentioned this when I talk about behind the wheel time. Budget. So, who are you working with? How long does it take to get there? What does that look like? And can you be there? So if that location is so far away that you can show up once a month, then, or maybe once a year, I should say. Is that enough? I think with my experience in working with the Alaska folks is that you have to be able to come, on a regular basis. And now, what does regular basis mean? It's different for each community. That might mean once every 2 months. That might mean once a month. Who knows? It can be very different. But you need to understand what those expectations of the community is, in that if it takes too long to get there, or you don't have the monies to be there as often as they would like for you to be there, then you need to reassess that. Communication. How do you best communicate? I've seen researchers send emails that are 2 pages long, and I'm not so sure where I'm supposed to start. I've seen researchers make phone calls and send text messages. I've seen them Snapchat. And so your communication, what kind of communication do you have? What works for you? And then how open is that communication? Is that something that you're willing to keep open at 10 o'clock at night when a community member reaches out, or advisory member reaches out to you? Or is it solely based within one platform? There's only communication if it's only through email, or what does that look like? So definitely assess what you're most comfortable with, and then later on, hopefully we can figure out some matching opportunities within the community. The next one I have here is vulnerability of the population. So this really seems to resonate when we talk about our population of tribal people and youth or elders. Some of our vulnerable populations, it raises huge flags when there's a target or an idea that is really solely based on them. So when it comes to youth, you can imagine that there's so much care and protections that sit there, that are out there ethically, even within an IRB, but within a tribal entity, there's even more barriers that are unwritten, and boundaries that we don't want to put our kids at certain levels of risk. So if the research project is really targeting a certain population, and that's considered a vulnerable population by that community or by others, then certainly I feel like you have got to make a solid effort to understand that vulnerability and why those feelings of vulnerability are there. And that not always easy. So be patient with that process. But it's definitely something we would hope that you would try to understand as best as you possibly can. Lastly, I have on here is helicopters. And when I first came into this work, somebody explained to me helicopter researchers. And as I've learned, many people haven't ever heard that term. But the best way to explain it is that somebody flies in a helicopter, and they look down and they see this and they see that, and they start making their notes, and they start making some comments and what they really see. But because they never landed, because they never spent time within that space, within that community, within that population, then their view was way up high, and you can only see so much, right? You can only see so much if you're flying by in a helicopter. And so I think communities have learned to look out for those helicopters, for what we refer to as helicopter researchers, and they're not respected. They're very much looked down upon, and I think that some of the traumas that we've experienced as communities with researchers have been helicopter researchers, people who never sat with us or asked a question, or sat with our elders and asked questions. And they just did a drive-by, said, this is the problem, this is what's wrong, blah, 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 and they were never really here. So it's their perception. But does that help us as a people? Is there benefit to that? Typically it hasn't been, and there's been numerous research studies that tribal communities are like, yep, there's another helicopter, there's a helicopter, And so we definitely want to avoid that. So you're going to plan to land your helicopter and be part of the community and walk on the ground and share meals and visit with us and listen. I think that's probably one thing I wish I probably should add to this PowerPoint is the ability to listen. Can you listen? Because if you come into a community room or a meeting room and you're not there to listen, I think our community members catch on to you pretty quick. And they recognize that, and you might lose interest rather quickly because of it. So open your ears, close your mouth, and listen as best as you possibly can. So let's jump to the next slide. That last slide is pretty long. So this slide is almost the same thing except for the idea of coming from a community perspective, from a partner perspective. And the same thing happens here in that I didn't change anything, any of the words. They're all ideal, or they're all the same as before. But the community does the same. I would ask the community to do the same thing. What type of commitment can they give you? If they have limited time and their resources are spread too thin, and they're like, I can talk to you 1 hour a month. That's it. Is that enough? Is that enough for you to be able to conduct your work? I mentioned timelines before, and I think that this is something that really comes to issue when the timeline isn't produced together in collaboration. The timelines from one view could be totally different from how the community may view it, or a partner, because you don't understand what the other requirements of a community might be, or the annual meetings they might have to attend, or the celebrations that are intermingled within it. So certainly, I think in my experience, the most troubles I've seen with timelines is because they were done one-sided and not through both lenses. Again, time allocation, so we kind of talked about that. Do they have people to work with you? One of the projects that I worked with, they definitely made sure that their budget was adequate, in that they were going to support a person within that department, and they wanted to make sure that they were compensated for their time and what they were asking. And I felt that that was one of the projects that was most respected from our community, because there was funding coming through. It wasn't all the money staying at a university level, but a good chunk of money was coming to the community, and it was very clearly laid out in their MOU. The department was going to do X, Y, and Z, and there was timelines put into place within that as well, and it worked really, really well. But that also allowed for those employees within that department to work on the project, because they were supposed to work on the project and they had funding to do so. So that's something to consider. I really jumped right straight into the budget when I was talking about that. So when you think about what kind of monies you may have, do you have monies for somebody within the community or within departments that are part of our community that would be of great assistance to you? A nice ally to work along with you in the research that you're trying to conduct. As a community member, I always wonder, what is our benefit? What are we going to get from this experience? And sometimes, especially with research, I feel like it's very different from other projects. Sometimes we get reports right away, but research takes time, right? It's not something that can be done quickly, and if it's done quickly, I think we're almost like a little cautious about that. But it just definitely takes time. But in understanding that there's a benefit at the end. One of the projects that when I was initially brought on, this project had been in our community for years and years and years, and so many things had been accomplished by the time I jumped onto the project. But the benefits were pretty clear, that there was medication that was identified as not being as effective for our American Indian women on this reservation. And so the oncologist, asked for the research. The community asked for the research, and the researcher responded. And now we've learned that there's not a very good outcome when our tribal people are using this medication. And so now we know that, all this work went into finding that out and finding research participants and explaining what the research was going to be. But now we know that there's a medication out there that is not ideal for some of our cancer patients. So that benefit's pretty amazing. But other benefits include just sharing the information of what you've learned, and understanding what that truly means, and that there's a meaning for us as a community, but there's also meaning for you within the academic fields. Goals. I think as a community, we sometimes have our own goals, and maybe they're out there, but they're a little bit different. So aligning those goals is not always an easy task. Some researchers have an expertise, let's say, in diabetes, and they're so strong in diabetes, but then one of the community members really wants to understand breast cancer and why that happens, and the diabetes specialist is like, I don't know, but maybe there's a relationship to be built. Maybe that diabetes specialist who's working at the university has a colleague who's very familiar with breast cancer research or breast cancer something, and there's a connection being built. So that's a great question. I don't have the expertise, but I know somebody who does. So aligning those goals can be a little bit tricky at times, but certainly we want to make sure that the community is being heard. And maybe those goals don't line up, and maybe it just doesn't work out. That has happened, and I've seen that happen. Behind the wheel time, and you might be wondering, like, well, why do they have behind the wheel time if they're a community member or a partner? Well, on my reservation, we can have meetings in St. Ignatius, but our participants of that meeting might live in Elmo. So it's an hour drive for them to participate in those meetings, and it's an hour drive home. Maybe in the dark because it's after a meal, a dinner meal, a dinner meeting, and for them to get home, it's late at night. So we have drive time too. Other communities might not have near the drive time, but you really need to consider what the drive time might be for your community members who are involved with the work that you're trying to accomplish. Transparency. Again, I think community, as you develop a relationship with community, they're going to tell you things. They're going to kind of give you the insider information, and they just so that you're in the know. And as your relationship grows stronger and stronger, you're going to hear more things, and they might be relevant to the work you're doing, and they might not be, but they want to be as transparent as they possibly can too. But if there's been a level of mistrust already developed, or there's a little bit of worry or hesitation, then that transparency might take a little bit more time for them to open up to you as a researcher and to have a trusting relationship with you. Understanding the project. So I guess, to be honest, I did change a word. So understanding of community was on the last slide, and this is understanding of the project. So this is an opportunity where the community needs to know what is trying to be accomplished. So if the grant proposal is completed, are you sharing that with them? Because if you're not, you really need to consider that. I think that being as transparent as you can, then it helps them. And then as they read through things, they can say, I don't understand this, or I don't think this is appropriate for our people. And they might just tell you exactly why that might not be appropriate, and maybe there's a different angle to take, whether it be the title of a project or an approach to the project or recruiting mechanisms for the project, whatever it might be. So the community needs to understand what the overall arching project is, and it just helps with that transparency level, right? Some of our community members have past and or recent experiences with researchers. There's multiple people I know who have participated in a couple different advisory groups, and so they're seasoned. They get what research looks like. They understand some of the timeline issues or some of the approval processes and so forth. So they might be well versed in it, while other community members haven't the slightest clue. This is their first research project. They don't understand what to do, or they might be even curious, how'd you get my phone number, kind of thing. So we all come from very different experiences, and so that is good to bad and everything in between. Approval processes. Even as community members, sometimes we don't understand the approval process. Sometimes we can talk to one council member and they tell us, all right, you need to do ABC. And somebody else can talk to a different council member and they say, oh, let's do XYZ. And they're totally different and you just don't know which way to go. So again, approval processes can be a little bit tricky. But ask and really dig into it and find out where these approvals need to come from and if there's a specific order in which those are to be obtained. Availability of the community. So again, this kind of goes to, is somebody willing to drive an hour to come to an advisory meeting? Are they willing to jump on a Zoom? Is Zoom even an option for people? Or do they want it? I think I would add to this availability of the community is that face-to-face interaction. There's something to be said when somebody comes and sits with you versus somebody who sends loads of emails. There's just a different relationship there. So my words of advice would be there, sit there, share a meal, allow conversation to occur, and don't think about your agenda, right? Or what you're the information you're hoping to leave with that evening. Let it be open, and then as time goes, and then your time and space with those community members goes, and then work on your agenda. But make sure that you understand that being together and sharing space with you face to face is very meaningful, and you showing that you're willing to make the drive. You're willing to sit in our office space or our meeting rooms or even in our homes speaks volumes, because we've met researchers who very much are not comfortable doing that. Location. Again, I think that goes back to, where is the research being conducted and how often is research or research ideas being presented. Some people that I've worked with, like I mentioned before, they're on multiple research projects or on advisory boards, and so they get spread too far, I think, sometimes. So making sure that you are meeting in a space that is best for the community, and it's easy access for the community members to be there is really important. Next, I have communication. So communication, again, like we mentioned before, like you have a level or a way that you'd like to communicate, but so does community. And when you develop those relationships with the community members, you want to ask them, what's the best way to communicate? On one of the teams that I'm on, it's kind of interesting, the advisory board members, like some of them are texters, some of them are Facebookers, it's just crazy. So I'm sure that the researcher actually has a list with all their names listed and their choice of, their ideal choice of communication. Especially if it's to remind them, hey, we have a meeting today, or what that might look like. So is there a little extra work put into that? Absolutely there is. But is it worth it? I think that there is true benefit to that, and finding out how the community wants to communicate with you or be notified or be reminded, whatever that might look like. Vulnerability of the population. So as a community member, we are very much looking at what, who this research is going to benefit. One of the projects that I was not very close with, but I kind of got to see some things on the outside of the efforts being done, I guess, and it was definitely, and it really had to do with suicide and some of the contexts in which the suicides were occurring. And the researcher was very cautious about how to go about this, and really found ways to talk with the community, but also offer support for the community. So it wasn't that this person was coming in and wanting to, like, okay, y'all share everything you got and I'm just going to run away with it. It was more of a process of, what are you experiencing? And let's visit about it. But at the same hand, there was resources right there. There was trained professionals. There was people who had experienced suicide within their families and had been able to process that and wanted to be there. So if your topic has indications or really meets this idea of working with a vulnerable population, be cautious and be patient, and very much open your ears, because sometimes that will allow you in the door, but sometimes if you're not listening well enough or not hearing what's being said, the doors might be closed on you. So understanding that vulnerability is something that it's there. We know it's there. What I might see as a vulnerable population might be a little bit different from what you see as a vulnerable population. So recognizing that there are different views and different experiences is really important as you're working forward with populations. Not very well said, but that's what it is. Helicopters. All right. Community members understand who the helicopters are, and they will give you grief. I have seen it, and it's in the form of teasing and poking at people at well, I didn't see you there. I didn't think, where were you when we had this meeting, or how come you weren't there? So they know, and I think that goes back to my comment earlier that if you are invited to an event, to a community activity, try to do your darndest to be there, because those invites don't come very easily. And if you do participate and you do come to that event, make sure you touch base with the person who invited you and that, thank you for inviting me. And ask for what do I do now? Or are there things I should be aware of as I'm here joining you, or whatever that might look like, because they want to see if you fit in. They want to see if you're willing to sit and share a coffee, or share a meal, or share a discussion. And they want to just learn about who you really are. So don't be a helicopter. Make sure you land. Make sure you're here. Your feet are on the ground, and you're here with the people. Well, that was objective 1. That seems like a long time, but now we're going to go on to objective 2. So identifying CBR principles that strengthen relationships with Indigenous populations. Here we go. There are 9 different principles, and so what I'd like to do is to start off in kind of chunks and talk a little bit about each of them. So we'll start off with the first 3. Number 1 is acknowledge historical experience with research and with health issues, and work to overcome the negative image of research. So sometimes there is a huge negative image, and sometimes I haven't even had any luck of cracking that nut. That it's just, that's how they feel, and that's the way it's going to be. So if you can look back and see what some of those traumas might have been within that specific community, I think that's a good thing. You need to ask. You need to find out if there's been past experiences that have been traumatizing or negative, then ask about them and make sure you understand them so you don't repeat that opportunity. Recognize tribal sovereignty. We are a tribal nation. We have our own tribal government. And so me as a person, I never feel comfortable speaking as if I'm the only tribal member. Never. I speak from my experiences, and many times I will sit down with elders, or I will consult with council members or people who have had past experiences within this, and try to get a better understanding of where people come from. So, but I also understand that the tribe has the ultimate authority, and if they say no, or if they are against it, then our tribal leadership has that right. So we have to respect that. Differentiate between tribal and community membership. This can be super tricky. On our reservation, we have people from all over the world. Our tribal college alone has represented over 70 different tribal nations, or First Nations in Canada. So it's a diverse community. We are Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, but that includes the Pend Oreille, a tribe that was part of this area as well. So sometimes differentiating that can be super difficult. So I think what I would say is ask your community, how do I say this, or who are we? Because community members could very much be tribally connected in so many ways, and just because they may not have a dark complexion or they don't have long hair and braids, that's not an indication that they don't understand our culture, our tribal ways, and are respected within our tribal community. So try to be really open about how to approach this. Okay. Moving on to number 4. Understand tribal diversity and its implications. This kind of goes to number 3 too, right? In that there are differences. I would say that I've learned that just because one person tells you that this is okay, it doesn't mean that that's universal for other people. So while we are one tribal nation, there could be many different views as to who we are as a people, and what we believe, what we practice within our culture, within our celebrations. So it's not always an easy one to understand, but be aware that there's diversity within us. If you come from the university system, I'm sure you are familiar that there's people of all colors and all races. And when we talk about our tribal people, we're not all the same. And some of us come from Crow, some of us come from Northern Cheyenne, some of us come from Salish, and some of us come from up in Browning. So it doesn't mean that we're the same. There might be similarities, but there's a lot of differences as well. Plan for extended timelines. I think this is something that's definitely a reality. Timelines can change in a moment's time. So when I mentioned that before, within the limitations and barriers, timelines that are built together are more realistic, meaning that the timelines that the researcher brings to the community are so much more realistic than being one-sided. Okay, so definitely make the effort to visit timelines so that they are realistic. Because if they're not, then you might not be able to obtain the goals that you had hoped originally. Recognize key gatekeepers. It can be tricky too, but I think there are multiple key gatekeepers within our communities. So if it's a health-related topic, I probably could give you a list of 5 different people that I would suggest that you possibly work with, whether it's within tribal health or within our hospital systems or otherwise, that there are gatekeepers within those entities. Or if you're doing research on the land and you want to understand different components, is it natural resources? Is it tribal preservation that you want to have involved? So gatekeepers, there's not one gatekeeper to everything. I just don't think that exists. But you want to know who are your helpers and your facilitators if that's something that you're willing to put the time into. And they can help you identify who those gatekeepers are. 7, 8, and 9, prepare for leadership turnover. This happens all the time. We're coming up right now we're in this space where we're voting for new members of our tribal council. So we're in preliminary area right now. So very soon we're going to be voting on who's going to take those chairs. And come January 1st, we'll have several new people in chairs. Some of them will be incumbents, so they've been there for a period of time, but others are going to be brand new. So just be aware of that. Even our departments have that as well. People retire, people leave, people transfer to different positions. And so I think the biggest or the best example that I can share here with turnover is that if you have a solid MOU with a department and a new department head comes in, it's very clear as to what's been going on versus a very brief MOU or something that's very, how do I say it, umbrella-like, in that you're not so sure what's going on, but there's a relationship. you want to make sure your MOUs are as specific as we can possibly make it, because we don't know. Leadership changes, and that's just the way things go. Number 8, interpret data within the cultural context. You can't do this unless you're involving cultural people. If you're not involving the community, this is a part of CBPR that you will not understand or will never achieve if you don't have those community members involved. And utilize Indigenous ways of knowing. This same thing with number 8 is that if you don't have that community involvement and those community members part of the work that you're doing, then you're not going to be able to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing. Our elders have stories. Our people have stories. Our community has experiences that are not published. They're not written. They're within our stories, or they're within cultural ceremonies and so forth, but it's not something that people can just run to the bookstore and purchase and understand. There's no book for that. But when you're doing your research and the work that you're doing, if you are really sensitive and you're really strong with your CBAPR approaches, you will have those people part of this, and they will help you in understanding how to utilize our Indigenous ways of knowing and how to be connected at a deeper level. All right, so what you might not have noticed in the work in this presentation is that in the past 4 slides, I've had chunks of this picture, okay? And so my point is that CBPR is pieces, but all together you have a different image. So I'm going to just click back really quick, and I'm going to show you. Oh, it actually won't let me do that. So this is new to me. So if you were to go back to your PowerPoint and you look at those last 3 slides, you're going to see different parts of this image. And what I was hoping to show you is that you might have this bison on the right-hand side by himself, right? You have another bull sitting over to the left who's sitting, right? And obviously there's a certain season because you have very snow-capped mountains. If you're only seeing a part of the picture and not seeing a full picture, you'll miss out on some things. And so I would hope as in providing this training that you really try to find the big picture and understand that sometimes there's the sitting bull, and sometimes there are moving parts and things are shifting and seasons are changing, but there is a full picture. There is a big picture.